Hi, everybody, and welcome to the last lecture for Biology 110. We've made it to the end of the semester, one more lecture, couple assignments, and then you're done. So today's topic is biology on a global scale. We started the semester looking at the nature of science and looking at atoms and cells, something we can only see with a microscope, and now we've made our way to the diversification of life and Earth as a whole. So we'll look at the different places where life occurs, they're called biomes, and we'll also look at climate change. So what's happening to the world today. But before we get into that, I just want to go over a couple of announcements. So the first being our ignorance reflection. The last one is due this Sunday. So this goes over the last parts of the book, the case histories, and the coda, so a couple last thoughts that the author gives you. Your last phylogeny presentation was due Wednesday, so if you're still working on it, great, get that done as soon as you can. I was really happy to see your first ones. I missed seeing you guys in class, so I'm really looking forward to these second ones to see what you've learned. I think this is a good assignment for digging into not only the research, but also a specific group of life. And so some information about the final, I have that up on Moodle, so if you've taken a look at that already, excellent. If you haven't, please look at the prompts. There's kind of 4 overall questions. Each one is worth 15 points. So instead of a comprehensive exam type final, this is more asking you to think about the course of the semester, what you thought was important that you learned, and how future students should do well, questions like that. So answer them as completely as you can. I'm excited to get your feedback. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're thinking. And so the final is worth 60 points. As you're looking at the semester as a whole and looking at your grade, there are 900 total points for the class. So you've gotten most of them up and done and graded. It's just this ignorance reflection, the final, and your last presentation. So you'll get those marked from me very soon, so you should know where you stand. If you have things that you still have to turn in, that's totally fine. This semester has been really tough, but I need everything in by Sunday, May 3rd. So grades from me are due to the registrar by Tuesday at noon. So if I don't have it by Sunday, May 3rd, I'm not going to have time to grade it. So just keep in mind, if you're still working through some assignments, that's totally fine, but make sure I get that by Sunday, May 3rd. Okay, so that's all the housekeeping I have. We're almost there. One last push to the end of the semester. So we're going to talk about today food webs. So kind of a mini ecology lecture, thinking about how organisms are interacting in their environment. We'll talk about what those environments are. We'll talk about biomes, and then we will discuss climate change. So the goals I have for this lecture, I hope by the end you'd be able to categorize organisms based on their ecological role. I'll tell you what that means more in a minute. Be able to describe what factors define biomes on the Earth or terrestrial. So what factors go into what one biome is versus another. I want you guys to get a glimpse of the consequences of climate change. I have a feeling you've heard this before and have some idea about what's happening, but I'll give you some specifics and, more importantly, some things we can do. So I want you to see yourself, you, as an important participant, not only in the food web around you, but also the globe as a whole. We're more connected now than we've ever been, literally and figuratively. So I want you to leave this lecture with some ideas about what to do that we can help combat climate change. Okay, so those are the goals. Now we'll get into it. So this is one of the most famous pictures. This is the first picture of Earth, the entire Earth that was taken from space. It was Earth Day this past Wednesday, April 22nd. It was the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. So the 50th Earth Day we've celebrated. It's turned into a global phenomenon So really important to think about where we are in terms of our relation to the entire planet. So kind of bringing it back down a little bit more specifically, what are food webs? You might have encountered these terms before, but scientists use these relationships to study organisms. So I'll get my laser here. We can measure the flow of energy within an ecosystem. So all of the animals, plants, organisms that are interacting together. We can study the flow of energy by following who's eating who, by following feeding patterns. So we looked at those protists that were either predators or prey or competitors. We looked at what they were eating, who they were eating. If any species increases or decreases, it can have an effect on the rest of this food web. So we can look at this example here. This seemingly could be my backyard. I don't know about you or the area where you live. But we have things that get eaten or get decomposed. So leaf tissue, rotting logs get broken down, dead leaves get eaten and broken down, and things that die, so roadkill, prey, etc. So these items get eaten or broken down by things like fungi and insects, bacteria, etc. So if an arrow goes toward an organism, it means that that organism is ingesting the thing that's pointing to it. So crickets can eat leaves. This is kind of one level of the food web. This is the next level right here. So things like bacteria, pill bugs, maggots get eaten by other things. Earthworms are able to eat things that have bacteria. They eat seeds. Millipedes eat the small things and can break things down. Robins, birds, are eating a lot of different things. They have lots of different arrows that are pointing to it. Other predators, right? So to make sure this fox population survives, we not only need robins and lizards, but we need all of the things that those robins and lizards eat. So if we take millipedes out of this food web, it can have really dire consequences for the other things that it either eats. There might be too many of the things that it eats without millipedes around, or the things that eat millipedes might not be able to survive. So food webs are tightly interconnected. They can change over time, but we can study how energy moves through an ecosystem by looking at who's eating who. So that brings us to this idea of a trophic level. So this just means kind of where in that food web you are. If you are in this triangle, in this pyramid at the bottom, you're a producer. So things that can photosynthesize, they're producing energy. They're not consuming other organisms. They're making their own. So plants, algae, things that can photosynthesize. Algae are plants, but cyanobacteria is a good producer, those organisms. So then if we move up here a little bit, herbivores, things that eat plants, are one trophic level above. They need to get their energy from these producers. Okay, and another trophic level above that is an omnivore, things that can eat herbivores, but they might also eat producers. And then carnivores, things that rely on other living things, so either omnivores or herbivores. They're not necessarily going to be able to eat a producer. And then things that decompose other things, so I'll go back to our food web on the previous slide. So maggots, pill bugs, crickets, they're able to eat things that are decaying. They're able to break down those food matter. We call those detritivores. So detritus is kind of things that are left over. So things that eat the leftover stuff. They're able to break down and decompose things that are decomposing. So we have these different levels that organisms can occupy. So primary producers, like I said, plants, things that don't ingest other organisms to survive. So in the really deep ocean floor, we have these cool ecosystems where these vents are spewing out hot sulfur compounds, and there are some things that can metabolize those. So more often than not, they're getting energy from the sun, but sometimes they can get energy from these other extreme sources. So producers, they're making their own energy, they're producing their own energy. And then here's the decomposer trophic level. So these are consuming organic waste, and that includes dead plants, so those leaves that are on the ground, dead animals, rotting logs, etc. So fungi are really good decomposers or detritivores. So consumers, if you're not a producer, you're consuming something. And this ranges those trophic levels from herbivore to carnivore. We can categorize these both as consumers because they have to consume other organisms to survive. And we can kind of break down consumers into different levels. So if we look on the right, we have our producers. Our cricket here is a primary consumer, primary being that they're eating producers directly. So primary consumers eat primarily things that have produced energy. Secondary consumers consume the primary consumers. So secondary because it's kind of one level removed. They're still consuming other organisms, but more often than not, they're consuming the primary consumers. Tertiary is just a fancy word for saying kind of third level. So tertiary consumers eat the things that are eating the primary consumers. So we can start to see the flow of energy moving up here. So how many maple leaves does it take to make sure the Cooper's hawk population stays at a certain level? And then if something came along and ate a Cooper's hawk, that would be considered a quaternary consumer. So these categories aren't solid. There can be organisms that go between these different categories. But this was just a general example. So for humans, right, we're omnivores. We can eat a variety of things. We're not a carnivore primarily. We're not an herbivore primarily. We're able to digest lots of different foods. But depending on what makes up our primary diet determines where in that trophic level we are. So if we are eating a vegetarian, vegan diet, something that's plant-based, only plants, we're eating producers, so that would put us in that lower trophic level. We'd be more in that primary consumer level. If you have meat as part of your diet, things that eat plants, so chickens and other primary consumers, they can eat small animals, but they mostly get a lot of their calories from plants. We'd be in that secondary consumer category. So it takes a certain amount of energy to produce fruits and vegetables. We need that same amount of energy then to feed the things that are eating those fruits and vegetables. So if we consume those, that's that upper level in the trophic pyramid. If we're eating things that eat things that rely on producers, we're moving up again in that level. So when we eat things like swordfish or other predatory fish and animals, it takes a lot more energy to produce those foods. So we're putting ourselves up higher in that trophic level. So thinking about what we're eating in our diet, it can change where we are in that pyramid. And that determines how much energy is being used to produce our food. So going along this idea, when we go between those different trophic levels, when we go from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, every time we move between those levels, we're losing about 10% of the energy. Oh, sorry, the opposite. Only about 10% of that energy is captured by that next layer. So it takes a lot of sunlight and water or nutrients to make plants grow. So in this example on the right, the producer in the system is a grass. The thing that eats the grass, this grasshopper, is only able to use about 10% of the energy that's in this grass. So on average, from every level, we're losing 90% of the energy in that system. So these grasshoppers all eat, they're fed, they're satisfied. The sparrow comes along and eats its fill of grasshoppers. Only 10% of the available energy that these grasshoppers represent makes it into those sparrows, and so on into this tertiary consumer. So by the time this falcon is fed, it's only using a very small fraction of the initial energy that was in the system. Okay, so that was food webs in a nutshell, thinking about trophic layers and where energy is coming from and how much can move through the system. It takes a ton of grass to get one falcon fed versus getting one grasshopper fed, because we lose so much energy going from one level to another. So what are all the places where these things live? So we're going to look at the globe. This is our flat map of the continents and the different areas in the world where things live. So we have lots of different types of places. I really encourage you to watch the Planet Earth and Planet Earth 2 series if you haven't yet, to see just the breadth and beauty of all these different places on Earth. We're going to get a small snapshot of them here. So we can separate the globe based on a lot of different things, but we're going to do it based on biomes today. So a biome, bio for life, ome, just where things are living. Biomes are communities of plants, fungi, animals, all of the organisms that occupy a distinct region. And so what determines where they are? Well, biomes are defined by the climate. So climate means a lot of different things. It means temperature, how much rain it gets, atmospheric pressure, lots of different things. So biomes are defined by the types of organisms that are living in a certain place and by what that climate is like. And so on this figure, you can see, based on color, a lot of the different habitats and areas and where they lie on the globe. So looking at the equator, the very middle of the Earth, and going either north or south, and seeing how the climate varies in these different places. So we'll start with wet forests. So tropical wet forests or rainforests primarily exist along the equator. Tropical wet forests get tons and tons of rain. That's one of the defining features of these forests. So often temperature doesn't fluctuate too much lower than 77 degrees or too much hotter than 86 degrees. So we'll see with climate change, a lot of these things might shift because these different areas are based on climate. We'll see these move around the globe as we go into the future. So just keeping that in the back of your mind. So rainforests tend to be along the same place, get tons and tons of rain, and that will determine who lives there. So tropical wet forests have the most biodiversity on the planet. I'll go back here so we can see some of the rainforests in Brazil and other places have more animals and plants and distinct organisms living here than in a very small area compared to the whole of North America. So in a very, very small area, tons of different species are concentrated, and that means if we take away that habitat, we're actually removing a lot more species than if we removed that same amount of habitat anywhere else on Earth. So they're biodiversity hotspots. That means there's tons of unique organisms that live in one area. And that area are tropical wet forests. So very dense vegetation. Things are growing very close together. There's different areas on the forest floor. And as you move your way up, just new habitats give tons of different organisms homes and food, and it's a very productive or biodiverse place. The plants there can grow year-round because the temperature doesn't fluctuate as much as in other places. And on the right, you see a couple of graphs. So we look on the bottom over the course of a year at how much rain they get in centimeters. And so there's rainy seasons and then drier seasons, and not very much temperature change. So those are tropical wet forests. And these are the kinds of things you'd see living there. Just really lush, amazing, colorful species. There are millions of unique species in these rainforests that live nowhere else on Earth. Moving on from wet habitats are subtropical deserts. So still in some tropical areas, but these places are defined by a low amount of rainfall. So these are going to be 30 degrees north. So when you're looking at latitude, it's just up a little bit or down a little bit from the equator. The temperature ranges here are a lot more, so 50 or so degrees Fahrenheit to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and not a lot of rainfall over the year. So as the globe gets warmer, as we're using water in different ways, these subtropical desert habitats are expanding. So we're making more desert on Earth. So here's kind of over the course of a year how much rain they would get. You can compare that to the tropical wet forest and see such a difference in habitat. Moderate temperature changes, so there is some variation throughout the year. The things that live in subtropical deserts have evolved to live in extremely dry environments. So they have really clever ways of holding on to water, like these cacti, these cactuses, and other kind of scrubby plants. So here are some of the animals that live in deserts, scorpions and things that are able to capture water when they can. Really amazing. Traveling sand dunes, these organisms have to adapt to change into really dry environments. Moving away from the extremes, we have a more temperate grassland biome. So as you can guess by the name, grasslands are dominated by grass species. Those are the primary organisms that drive what the habitat looks like. These are going to lie between the 25 and 45 degree latitude lines. So moving a little bit farther north and a little bit farther south. They have a little bit more of a wider temperature range, so they can get pretty cold and they can get pretty warm with a wider range of rainfall as well. So a lot of what used to be prairie, we can call temperate grasslands. So in the Midwest and the western area of the United States on into Texas, lots of really dry grassland areas. So these are places where you'll see 4 distinct seasons. So like central Illinois is somewhat similar. Sometimes there are droughts. So there's some water availability, but not enough to sustain a lot of trees. So that's why the habitat is dominated by grasses. A lot of times their roots are able to go really deep, so they can take advantage of the water table when there's not enough rainfall. So temperatures can range from below freezing to 80, 90 plus degrees. And then we see a wide range of waterfall throughout the year. So temperate grasslands, things that used to be prairies. So these are some of the really amazing animals like saiga, these cool antelopes, just swaths of grass, not many trees around, prairie dogs, bison in the western U.S. So these were animals, prairie dogs and bison, that used to cover most of the lower 48 states, but due to habitat loss and people killing them off, there are small bastions where they live now. Another big biome that covers a lot of the U.S. and other places are temperate forests. So rather than being mostly made of grass, forests have tons of different tree species, similar ranges in temperature, similar changes in rainfall, with a little bit more rain coming to these areas. So in the northern hemisphere, our winter is in January, so December to March. In the southern hemisphere, winter is during our summer. But in any case, trees will lose their leaves. As the seasons change, the temperate forests have all 4 seasons as well. So these areas cover a lot of the U.S. And here are some animals that live in temperate forests. So red pandas, deer, raccoons, a really lovely picture of the leaves changing during the fall. Another type of forest that we have are boreal forests. So these are much colder, and these are restricted to areas high up in the northern hemisphere, so 50 to 60 degrees in the northern latitudes. So high temperature variation, very cold, very long winters, and short, mild summers. So there's going to be smaller species diversity in these boreal forests compared to the rainforests. The cold temperatures kind of dominate most of the year. So only a little bit in the summer months do we see it rise above freezing. And again, these are averages, so it's going to shift as we go, but dominated by these evergreen trees, things that can survive really cold environments. So we see really cool adaptations to things that survive in the cold. So we have badgers and wolverines and other predators with thick coats, moose, wolves. These are animals that live in boreal forests. And then in even colder climates, we have the Arctic tundra. So between 60 and 75 degrees north latitude, really, really cold temperatures. So it's a very extreme environment, so we see even less species diversity than before. However, there are still unique animals and plants that live in these regions. So as we see the globe warming, as we change where these biomes are found, sometimes animals and plants have nowhere else to go. So we see extinction related to too much extreme variation in these places. So instead of big evergreens, it's so cold that only low-lying plants are able to grow. So that changes what can live where. So these are the types of things that you'll see living in these places. So adapted to cold climes, very snow-covered areas, you might see white coloration more often, really thick coats, things that live really close to the ground. So lots of cool lichen and moss species can be prevalent here. Things that are adapted to extremes. So those were some environments. We covered biomes from tropical rainforests all the way to the Arctic tundra. These are very small snapshots of these different places on Earth. There's lots of other variations within these big categories, but those are kind of, in a nutshell, the different types of habitats we have on Earth. And like I said, they're defined by climate, and we know that the climate is changing. So I showed you this picture at the beginning. It's a very powerful image. The people that took it weren't actually supposed to take it. They were supposed to be really busy with their tasks at hand. They were on an Apollo mission, so they were on their way to the moon. But they couldn't help themselves from looking back at Earth as a whole. So this picture was taken in the early 1970s. The first Earth Day was 1970. So what has changed between then and now? A seemingly not very long amount of time. Well, we can look at this list, and I took this list from the book, The Story of More, if you want to read more about it. But since 1969, twice as many people are living on planet Earth. We've been able to triple the amount of wheat and corn and beef we produce. The amount of energy used across the globe has tripled since 1969. Our use of plastic has increased more than 10 times. We're releasing 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. Our global surface temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius, which might not seem like a lot, but we'll get into that in a minute. Our global sea level rise the global sea level has risen by 4 inches. 2 of those inches are because the water is expanding when it gets hot, and 2 of those inches because the melting of the glaciers at the poles. And we talked when we looked at fossils and phylogenies, we looked at the fossil record, and we're seeing evidence that we're in a 6th extinction. Since the years 1969, more than half of all amphibian, butterfly, and bird species are in decline. And 1/4 of all fish and plant species are also in decline due to things like habitat loss in the changing environment. So even just in these last 50 years or so, we've changed human behavior to the point where we're able to make more than we've ever made before, we're consuming more than we've ever consumed before, and it's taking a toll. So I don't know if you have seen XKC comics before, but they're fantastic. If you haven't seen this comic before, please go to this link and check it out. It's a very long comic you can scroll through to see how the temperature has changed, the global average temperature has changed since the year 20,000 BC. So thinking about how the planet's warming, why is 1 degree so significant? Well, you can scroll through this whole comic. I've just captured the very top portion and the very last portion. And as you're scrolling through, you can see how since 20,000 years ago, the climate has changed on our planet. So starting back then, there were these huge ice sheets that covered a lot of the globe. So you'll see when they recede and all the other kind of things that have happened in human history up to this point. And as you're going through, right, we're a science class, we like data, so just keep in mind that there's some limits of how they presented the data in the comic. But you can find the primary sources they used right here if you're interested. So I encourage you to kind of pause this video, go to this link, and scroll through so you can see how the global average temperature has changed over the course of human history. But we'll skip to the end. So we'll go back to the beginning real quick. These boxes are 1 degree centigrade in each direction. So when the global average temperature was 4 degrees less than it was between 1961 and 1990, we had huge ice sheets covering the Earth. So we were in an ice age. So 4 degrees global average temperature difference meant that we were in an ice age. So we'll skip to the end. There have been periods where it was a little bit colder. But just in the last few decades, we've veered so far to the right in this diagram. We've started to get so much warmer that we're on track to heat the world significantly. So 4 degrees colder was Ice Age, even 2 degrees warmer than this average between 1961 and 1990 could mean we're in for a lot of changes for the planet. So scroll through that comic. It's really interesting to see the scale of change. But depending on our actions now and in the next few years, it will determine what path we're on. So as an example of what this might look like in terms of the planet getting hotter, it will look different in different places. So the whole globe is not warming equally. But thinking about in the United States, a lot of this warming is fueled by the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas. It releases carbon dioxide. This carbon dioxide gets trapped in our atmosphere and can lead to different spots of warming. It's not a matter of if something will happen in the future, we're already feeling those effects. So if we can't reduce the amount of fossil fuels we burn, if we can't reduce the amount of carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, I'm living in central Illinois, where Illinois College is. If we keep going on the path we're on, if we don't make any changes by the end of this century, so 2100, summers in Illinois will feel like summers feel in Texas right now. In 30 years, it'll feel like Oklahoma, Louisiana, kind of that area. So a lot more hot, a lot more humid. If we are able to curb our use of fossil fuels, it might not get as hot as it could be. So this diagram isn't to show that that Illinois is moving anywhere. It's just meant to show that the temperature is going to get a lot hotter. So same thing with Michigan. A colder area, snows a lot currently. If we don't do much to change, it might end up like North Texas, West Oklahoma, really dry, hot places. So you can check out the data for yourself. This is from the EPA's website. But make sure you go to the website that was archived before January 2017. So just to bring it home as an example. So these next couple of slides are some more examples of what is changing due to climate change. I'm not going to go through every case, but we've talked a lot about terrestrial or land biomes. There's different areas in the ocean too. The ocean is changing a lot also in response to all of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. It's getting warmer, it's getting more acidic, and there's less oxygen around. And that has really drastic implications for the things that live in the ocean. And since humans eat a lot of things and use a lot of things that come out of the ocean, it's not good for us either. And then here's another infographic that summarizes a lot of the different problems that are arising. So things like you might not associate with climate change, but when things get really hot, we see a lot more vector-borne infections or illnesses we can get from things like ticks. So if there's not really hard freezes, these ticks don't die off as much. So if they persist longer, there's more of them, there's a higher chance that we can get sick from a tick bite. And just lots of other specific examples of how climate change is driving a lot of these things. So it can get really overwhelming thinking about the degree to which things are changing and how hard it can be to stop it. But I have a lot of hope. We have a lot of agency and a lot of power to change things, and we need to change things. So here's the hopeful message part of this lecture. So people that live in the U.S. and people that live in certain Western industrialized countries use more energy than the rest of the world. The U.S. specifically uses more energy than anywhere else on Earth. So that's a problem, but that also means that any actions we take have a larger impact than anywhere else. So if people in the U.S. change our behavior, it has huge implications for the planet. So I encourage you guys to look at these infographics, to find your own information, and find something you care a lot about. So that will be different for everyone. If you're concerned about conservation and the species that are in decline, people's energy use, human health, there's a lot of implications for human health as a result of climate change, social justice, all of these different things can be related. Find a cause that you care passionately about and find some ways to help. So think about what actions you can take. So if you're worried about conservation, advocating for things like proper land use management, marine sanctuaries, setting aside more habitat, preserving species, helping places like zoos and aquariums with their work. There's tons of options. With energy, you can think about how much energy you use and reduce the big things like heating and cooling and hot water heaters in homes, reducing food waste. There's no right answer to what you can do. There's tons of actions that are available. So we need to work together, and especially people that are in the younger generations that are going to feel the effects even more. The actions we take individually are important. So here's a couple examples. So if you think about the trophic levels we were in, different types of food take a different amount of energy to produce. So things like beef and lamb, because they eat a lot of plants, it takes a lot of energy to produce the calories that we get from beef and meat, chicken, things like that. So if you're worried about energy use and CO2, changing what you eat and how often you eat certain things can have a big impact. And again, thinking about that flow of energy. So if we occupy those lower trophic levels, a lot more energy is going into us rather than being wasted and going through other organisms on the chain. So we actually produce enough food today on planet Earth to feed everyone enough. It's just a problem of distribution. So using less resources and sharing more is a good take-home message from this idea. So we can get a lot of that energy out of producers. If other things are eating this and then we're eating those things, that's a lot more energy that has gone through, that has been dissipated to other things before it gets to us. So we can change our eating patterns. We can change what foods are available to different people. But we can't do that alone.